I have been seeing an alarmingly large number of people on other Facebook pages who have broken their plastic beater bowls and the beater whisk attachments. I've also seen that some people are apprehensive about experimenting with their mixers and are wary about using different attachments because they're afraid of breaking them. This is unsettling to me, and so I've decided to make this video in the hope that I can help members of our Facebook group avoid having the same sort of damage, and also give people some assurance that as long as you keep certain things in mind, it's all right to experiment, and indeed we should all be experimenting with this mixer to find out what works best for us. I find the trajectory of the conversations troubling. When people post pictures of their broken attachments, the conversation almost always goes along the same lines. The person who posts the picture with the broken item is clearly very upset. The argument then splits into a few different lines. There is generally one group of people who will bring out their pitchforks and claim that Ankarsrum is to blame, and that for such an expensive mixer that holds itself out as being sturdy and tough, it should not have any plastic parts. And they also claim that the attachments are flimsy and cheap. The other group of people will accuse the person who has posted the picture of not using the mixer correctly and claim that it is user error, which of course antagonizes the original poster. In almost all cases, the original poster will double down and get very defensive. They will claim that it's not user error. They'll claim that they read the instruction manual and watched the instructional videos. Incidents like this will create or reinforce negative views in the original poster about the Ankarsrum, and in some instances, I have seen that this appears to have led to the person leaving the group altogether, and perhaps not even wanting to use their Ankarsrum anymore. I have gone back through around 5 years of broken attachments in the other Facebook groups to see whether there are any common elements. My assessment is that in some instances, it appears to genuinely be a manufacturer error, and in those cases, Ankarsrum appears quite ready to replace the part. In some instances, it is pure bad luck. For instance, there was one time I saw that somebody dropped their plastic bowl on a hard floor, and it cracked. In most cases, though, it is usually because the person has not thought about the texture and consistency of their dough, whether at the start of the process, and also what it will look like and feel like towards the end of the mixing process. I think a lot of people don't take into account the fact that some of the doughs and batters that we work with are not static consistencies and they will change over time. So in contrast to something like a Swiss meringue buttercream, egg whites, cream or mascarpone that will largely retain a very soft texture even at the end of the mixing process, there are a few things that will change and become firmer if you leave them to sit. Anything that contains a flour with gluten, anything that contains large amounts of icing sugar, like royal icing or American buttercream. If it's winter, something like American buttercream can set pretty hard, even if you don't put it in the fridge. People need to equate some of the batters that they're working with as being a little bit like melted chocolate or melted butter, or even cement. It starts out liquidy, but as time passes, it will harden. There are a few things to think about when you're deciding which attachment to use. The Ankarsrum is very sturdy and very versatile, and what I like about it is that you can actually use different attachments for different things at different times, depending on what you want. It gives you a variety of options and choices, and more control over the process. If you're used to a standard stand mixer, this can be an unwelcome amount of freedom. For me, I generally use the dough roller and the main bowl for most things, but there are definitely times when I'm using the beater bowl, whether plastic or stainless steel, and the balloon whisks and single beaters, which are also called the cookie whisks. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's a real shame that a lot of people are not using their beater bowls because they're scared of breaking the whisk attachments. This won't happen if you're careful and you think ahead. These are the following things to take into account. Know your dough or batter. What will the dough or batter look like at the end of the mixing process? What are the mix-ins that you're going to put into the batter or the dough? When I'm using the dough roller, I tend to add mix-ins into the batter after I've creamed the butters and before I add the flour and other dry ingredients, because I find that this incorporates them more evenly. For conventional stand mixers, they usually tell you to add the flour first and then the mix-ins, whether you add it into the mixer or you're going to stir them in by hand. I have assumed that this is because with many standard stand mixers, because of the bowl size, if you add the mix-ins first and then the flour, you may not get an even distribution. In contrast, the Ankarsrum's main bowl is so large, there will be no incorporation issues. When I'm using the beater bowl and the whisk attachment, I follow the standard methodology, which is that the flour is added first. I will then take out the whisks and pour the mix-ins into the beater bowl and mix them in by hand with a spatula if it's cake batter. If it's a cookie dough, I will transfer the cookie dough into another bowl that doesn't have the annoying thing in the middle. The annoying thing in the middle of the beater bowl is not good if you want to do a lot of folding or mixing by hand. The next thing to take into account is whether you intend to pour or scoop the batter out of the bowl. The main bowl is heavy, so it's not very good for pouring, given that for obvious reasons, it doesn't have a spout or a handle. The bowl needs to spin around and around. For cake batters that are very thick, I'll use the dough roller. If I'm making a very light and loose batter, generally for a foam cake, like a genoise or a vintage cream cake, then I tend to use the plastic beater bowl so that I can pour it easily into the baking pans. If I'm making chiffon cupcakes, the main reason I'm pretty comfortable using the main beater bowl with the dough roller is that I do not pour the batter. When I'm making cupcakes, I use a large ice cream scoop to portion out the batter, and that works very well within the main bowl. Even for chiffon cakes, I still tend to use the main bowl just because I like it better for chiffons, even though it does mean I have to scoop. The next consideration is, do you want to fold or use a hand whisk to incorporate any elements of the batter? I make a lot of chiffon cakes, which require you to use a folding technique with a spatula to incorporate the yolk batter with the egg white batter. I use a coated hand whisk to do this so that I do not damage the bowl, but even when I'm using a whisk, I still prefer to do it in the main bowl rather than one of the beater bowls, simply because it is easier to ensure full incorporation because it doesn't have the annoying thing in the middle. The next consideration is whether you want to aerate the batter or is the intention just to combine and make it smooth. All of the roller, balloon whisks and cookie whisks will incorporate air, but the balloon whisks will do it the fastest. Instances where you will want to maximize aeration are whipping cream, whipping egg whites for meringues, chiffons, foam cakes, macarons, whole eggs for genoise foam cakes. Instances where you want a smooth batter but not necessarily very much air are cheesecake fillings, non-foam cakes, and tart fillings. This is because you don't want the filling or the cheesecake to rise very high and then collapse again. The next factor is, what is your timing? Typically, creaming butter and whisking eggs or cream in the main bowl with the dough roller will take a little longer than the whisk attachments. This is a good thing if you want to multitask, but sometimes if you want to do things in a hurry, then you would go straight to the beater bowls and the whisks. Finally, in terms of whether or not you want to use the stainless steel beater bowl versus the plastic beater bowl, do you want to heat the bowl directly? For me, it is useful that the stainless steel bowl can be heated directly over a saucepan to form a bain-marie, but frequently these days I actually just use a heat-proof bowl, heat that up, and then just pour that into whatever bowl I'm using, whether it's the stainless steel or the plastic beater bowl. So for me, all of the above questions are things that you need to ask yourself and consider the answers to before you pick which attachment you're going to use. In some instances, it's a fairly blanket statement. For instance, if you're going to make bread or a really heavy cookie dough, you would definitely use the roller and you would never use anything else. But there are some instances where it really depends on your timing and what you're intending to do. The other thing that I think that is very important to do when using the Ankarsrum is to plan things ahead of time and do what they call mise en place. So read the recipe all the way through. That is a bit of a motherhood statement, but it is extra important to always read the recipe and the instructions before you start making anything. A lot of the mistakes that I've seen with the Ankarsrum have been because people in their excitement to use their mixer have just leapt in and gone with the whisk attachments because they're the most familiar, even if they may not be the most appropriate. Next, I recommend watching a lot of YouTube videos for whatever it is you want to make. If you watch videos, you can see the timing, you can see what you need to juggle, you can see the texture of the batter or the dough at different stages of the process. I also recommend looking at the official Ankarsrum recipes. At the date of this video, I actually haven't made any of them myself, but I frequently look at the official recipes because you can basically draw some conclusions or compare their recipe with what you're intending to make to see whether or not you're using the right attachment. If you're uncertain, I recommend starting with those first. The next thing you should do is once you've done that research, you should calculate the timing for the various phases of whatever you're going to make. The prep time, the mixing time, the baking time, all that sort of stuff. Mise en place is really important. So have everything ready to go before you start turning anything on. What I mean is have the ingredients measured out, the pans and the bowls are ready, decide in advance in what order you're going to do everything, decide what you want to do while the Ankarsrum is doing its thing. Are you going to be watching it or are you going to be running around and doing other things? Because that will affect what you are choosing in terms of the attachments. As I mentioned before, even though the mixer is very expensive and it holds itself out as being very tough, it is certainly not indestructible. You have to use it in accordance with the guidance and the instructions that are given. And you also need to use common sense. Sometimes I feel like people go out of their way to be extra rough with it just because they think that it is indestructible. So you still have to use the right attachment for the right task. Another misunderstanding that people have is that they think that the stainless steel beater bowl will fix everything. They think if they get that bowl, that will mean that they won't break their whisk attachments. This isn't true. All this means is that if you use the wrong attachments, you probably won't break the steel bowl, but you'll still break your whisks and the gear attachments. This is because even though the bowl will stay firmly in place and it won't break, if you're trying to force your whisk attachments through a very thick, unyielding dough or batter, they're going to snap or start to disintegrate. The Ankarsrum was designed for the bowl to spin around, so that is why when they are modifying it so that the whisk attachments are turning, it's not going to have the same strength. In terms of tips for how to know your dough or batter, as I mentioned above, the best thing to do when choosing your attachments is to really know your batter. So some of the things that you could look at to think about what the batter is going to end up looking like is if immediately after you finish mixing your cookie dough, you can immediately roll it into balls, chances are it may be too thick for the beater bowl, and you should probably be using the dough roller. If the cookie dough remains very soft and is almost liquid, and you have to let it sit for at least 30 minutes or several hours, either on the counter or in the fridge before you can scoop it out with an ice cream scoop, it is possible that this sort of cookie dough will be fine for the beater bowl and the single beaters. Recipes that require you to use melted butter or brown butter are frequently, but not always, softer. A word of warning though, this is not definitive. You have to be careful because sometimes the reason the recipes have told you to let the dough sit is not because they want the dough to become firmer, it's because they're trying to enhance flavors. So it can be a little bit dangerous to just rely on those indicia. For me, the safest bet is that you know the dough well already before you dive in and start making it. This could be because you've made the cookies before, whether with the Ankarsrum or with another mixer. You've watched the YouTube videos, so you know exactly what the consistency of the dough is at the end of mixing, or you've spoken to someone else who has made the dough or batter. Another cautionary note. In all cases, after you add liquid to a flour with gluten, it is going to start to thicken. Once liquid is added, the more you mix it, the more you're activating the gluten and the thicker it will get. On top of that, the longer you leave the dough to sit, the more the flour will get hydrated by the liquid and it will become very firm. So there are some cookie doughs that would be otherwise completely fine to mix in the beater bowl because the expectation is that you'll transfer the dough out of the bowl to sit and then scoop. But if you let them sit in the beater bowl for too long, they're going to be too firm. And so if for whatever reason you want to go back and mix them again, you won't be able to use the whisks. Another scenario is that 3/4 of the way through mixing a soft dough cookie, you get distracted, you leave the dough sitting in the bowl for a few hours, it's going to firm up, and so when you come back, you're not going to be able to continue mixing with the whisks. So, in conclusion, I really hope that this was of some use to some of you. My fear is always that people will get offended that I am being patronizing or talking down to them, but I am honestly just trying to minimize the risk of breakage and damage because I do know how expensive these things are. On top of that, as someone who is a hobby baker and bakes a lot, I know that it's very distressing when one of our regular tools breaks down. For instance, when my oven was out of action for a few months, this was a very depressing time of my life. I also want to try to reduce conflict in our group because I've certainly seen conflict break out in other groups when people have taken very different positions about whose fault it is when an attachment breaks.